Merhaba, or hello and welcome. That was Maltese if you weren't aware, or so Google Translate tells me anyway. And I have more. Yusimni, Marion Jones. I'm Marion Jones. Okay, run out of Maltese now, so back to English. This is City Breaks Valletta, Episode 4, Finding World War II on Malta, which actually, it won't be difficult to do. It seems to be everywhere. For a start, you can't possibly miss the George Cross, seen on posters and packaging, in the top corner of the front page of the Times of Malta, the enduring symbol of what was possibly Malta's proudest moment, April 15th, 1942, when King George awarded the island the Cross of St George in recognition of the people's resilience. The other contender for the Proudest Moment award is, of course, the Great Siege from 1565, as discussed in the last episode. Anyway, this episode, World War II, a few historical pointers to start with about what actually happened on Malta during the 1940s, and then a rundown of 3 museums, 2 in Valletta, 1 very close, which will tell you much, much more about the story. It all began then on the 10th of June 1940, when Italy joined the war and pledged to fight alongside the Germans. So Malta, being only 100 kilometres or so south of Sicily, suddenly became the front line, and sure enough, the very next day, the 11th of June, the first Italian bombers arrived. They targeted the island's airfields, they bombed the Grand Harbour, and everyone on Malta knew immediately that this was going to be serious. So they set about leaving some of the most dangerous areas, moving away from the harbour area, for example, building shelters, that is, digging them out underground, some 2,000 in total in the end, protecting their historic buildings as far as they could, taking artistic treasures somewhere safer, and thinking about what they possessed to help them in the fight back. At first, the answer to that was not very much. In fact, famously, there were so few planes on the island that the 3 Gloucester Gladiators they could find, they'd been left behind, I think, by an aircraft carrier. Anyway, they played such a crucial role that they were all given their own names: Faith, Hope, and Charity. Italian bombs kept coming. In 1941, things got worse. The Luftwaffe came to support the Italians. And on the other side, the British particularly were thinking what they could do. On January the 10th, for example, the British aircraft carrier Illustrious arrived, bringing much-needed planes, but it was badly bombed. 126 officers and crew were killed, and after she arrived in the harbour, the bombing intensified. Over 100 German planes, although somehow the ship did manage to slip out of the harbour a few days later and set off back to the US, where she was going to be repaired. There was another terrible incident during that period in Vittoriosa, so over in the 3 cities, where the St Lawrence Church was directly hit by a bomb and 35 people hiding in the crypt were killed. In July that year, a convoy arrived in Malta, bringing much-needed supplies, but it was immediately attacked by torpedo boats from Italy. More damage done then to the Grand Harbour, although in fact in the end all the Italian boats were sunk or captured. I bought a little guidebook called World War II on Malta, in which I read the following sentence: 1942 was without doubt the worst year of the siege. Malta earned the unenviable title of the most heavily bombed place on earth. In April alone, 6,727 tons of bombs were dropped on the island. On the 7th of April that year, for example, the Royal Opera House in the middle of Valletta was destroyed by a direct hit. It was at this point too, on the 15th of April, that King George awarded the George Cross to the island. Here's the citation: "To honour her brave people, I award the George Cross to the island of Fortress Malta, to bear witness to a heroism and devotion that will long be famous in history." There were moments of hope, such as in May, when the Spitfires arrived, the long-awaited, much-needed planes from the RAF. But just a month after that, in June, came Operation Pedestal, when the convoys expected, with much-needed supplies, failed to arrive, and the food situation became increasingly desperate. Devastating, of course, for the population of Malta, but also strategically terrible news. To quote the guidebook again, if Malta couldn't survive, The British Army fighting in North Africa would be defeated, leaving the way open for the Germans to advance into the Middle East and the rich oil fields of the Caucasus. So another convoy would have to be sent, and 14 merchant ships duly set out. Here's the guidebook again. The convoy entered the Mediterranean on the night of the 10th of August, 1942, and so started one of the most dramatic and fierce battles of the Second World War. The might of the German and Italian was prepared to meet them, and on the 11th of August they struck the first blow, when the German submarine U-73 sent 4 torpedoes into HMS Eagle, which sank in just 8 minutes, taking 230 crew with her. This was the start of 3 days and nights of continuous attack from the air, the sea, and underwater. The convoy sailed steadily towards Malta, but many of them were not destined to make it, as one by one they were picked off by the enemy. After 3 days and nights, 3 ships did make it, and were greeted at the Grand Harbour by throngs of Maltese people, waving flags and handkerchiefs and hugging each other with joy and relief. 2 more ships made it through, the Brisbane and the Ohio, and here from the guidebook is a description of its arrival in the Grand Harbour. Quote, "The tanker had managed to survive, and although her deck was awash, she limped into harbour and into legend, aided by 2 destroyers, lashed to her on either side. Only 5 of the 14 ships that started out managed to make it to Malta, but the precious cargo they were carrying was enough to give the island a new lease of life. Before the convoy arrived, Malta had enough provisions for just 1 week before surrendering. The cargo and oil were quickly unloaded from the ships and stored in underground facilities. Malta would fight on. The war in its entirety had another 2 years to run, but the key date for Malta was the 25th of July 1943, when the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was removed from power by his own people, and then on the 8th of September that year, Italy surrendered to the Allies. As the guidebook I've been using put it, Malta could breathe again. So, moving on to think about the 3 museums then. There are others, but these are the 3 I visited, and I think they're the main ones, really, for telling the story of World War II. So they would be the National War Museum, which is in Fort St Elmo in Valletta, a museum called Malta at War, which is over in Birgu in the 3 cities, easily reached by boat from Valletta. I'll be talking about that a little more in a future episode on Days Out. And that museum takes a different stance, less about telling the big story of the war and more about telling the story of the Maltese people and what daily life was actually like during wartime. And thirdly then, back in Valletta, the Lascaris War Rooms, which was the headquarter of British forces on the island. I can recommend all 3 in their different ways. So let's start with the National War Museum at Fort St Elmo. Very easy to walk to from the city centre. It's pretty much just at the end of Merchant Street or Republic Street. It covers actually all periods of history, from the Bronze Age right up to Malta gaining its independence. It's pretty comprehensive, separate, detailed exhibitions on both the Great Siege and World War II, but lots of other things besides. It might be one of those places where you want to pick and choose a little bit what you want to see, and since it's all laid out in chronological order, that's quite easy to do. The section on the Second World War has loads of information panels and lots of photographs and memorabilia, including some large objects. For example, here you can see the Jeep which President Roosevelt drove, or possibly was driven in, I'm not sure. And you can see one of those little gladiator planes, Faith. And most particularly of all, you can see in a glass-fronted case the actual George Cross and the original letter containing the citation, given pride of place, of course, as is only fitting for the highest civilian award for bravery which could ever be given, and was in fact given only ever once to a whole nation, and that, of course, was Malta, this one. You could definitely spend a whole morning, perhaps even longer, at the museum, but if you want to scale it down a bit and just seek out the parts on the siege and World War II and possibly have a look round the outside of the fort itself, then I'd say you want to allow perhaps an hour and a half or so. Equally fascinating is the Malta at War Museum over at Birgu. You might choose to go out there specially to see it, or perhaps you'll incorporate it in a day out generally to the 3 cities. Again, if you look carefully at everything that's there, a whole morning or afternoon wouldn't be too long to allow, but you can certainly get the gist in, let's say, half that time. So the ground floor is a museum, telling the story of the war, but very much with the emphasis on daily life. So learning about the 100,000 people on the island who were displaced, about the shelters that they built. An incredible number, I think I've already mentioned, about 2,000, I think. Enough, in fact, for the whole population of the island. You'll learn about the work of something called the Civil Society in wartime, and about many aspects of life during wartime on the island. The blackouts, the air raids, the work of the bomb disposal teams, the rationing, the food shortages. Water was very scarce too. People had to queue up at pumps for small quantities to take home in buckets. There was a black market, and there were endless queues. One book I read which told me quite a lot about this is something called Ladies of Lascaris by Paul MacDonald. It's actually a biography of one lady who went from Britain to Malta just before the war to be a dancer in a cabaret, and who ended up working in the plotting rooms at the Lascaris war rooms. I'll be talking more about that book in future episodes, but now is a good moment to just give you one or two details from it about everyday life on the island. The author quotes Christina herself, talking about the lengths people had to go to find anything to eat. She said, "When rabbit stew was offered, one did not ask what had become of the cat." He uses lots of quotations from people's letters and diaries, including one from a 12-year-old boy, one Eddie Quell, who recalled that one of his most vivid memories was of queuing for everything. As he put it, whether it was raining or hot and sweaty, we queued for milk, which was a 1-pint bottle for 8 of us per day. For kerosene, I took a wine or spirit bottle to fill, and that was on a first-come, first-served basis. Many times I was so far back in the queue that none was left. In the same chapter, there's a description of the Victory Kitchens, which were set up all over the island. They really were a way for the authorities to control the food supply and make sure that everybody got something, even though it was impossible for anybody to get enough. Here's what he writes about those. Quote, "It was not long before they were catering for almost the entire civil population. Indeed, it was due to these VKs, Victory Kitchens, as they were dubbed, that the people owed their survival through those grim days of hunger. The black market was rife on the island, and had there been no control of what supplies there were, no meting out of a fair share to all, however meagre, Malta might not have been able to claim that there were no deaths to starvation. So the Victory Kitchens served one portion of food per person per day. You had to go and collect it and hand over a little coupon. You could buy a booklet of 7 for 3 shillings. And the author gives an example of a week's menu from one of the Victory Kitchens. Monday and Thursday, the same thing, minestra, which is vegetable soup. Even that must have been difficult if water was so short. On Wednesdays and Saturdays, 1 sardine with a few haricot beans. On other days, a small helping of spaghetti or goat's meat in gravy. And on Tuesdays, something called balbugliata, which, as he explains, is normally a lovely dish made of scrambled eggs with cheese and onions and tomatoes in it. But wartime balbugliata, explains the author, had almost nothing in common with it at all, being, quote, unappetizing, a powdered egg concoction masquerading under the name. The displays, memorabilia, photographs, information panels, etc. on the ground floor of the Malta at War Museum will give you lots of insights into this sort of thing. But there is more, because the museum is built on top of an actual shelter complex from the 1940s, and you can climb down the narrow stone staircase to visit it. What you'll find down there is a complete labyrinth of little corridors and rooms, some of them communal dormitories, others with grisly-sounding titles such as birthing room or surgery. You can see the air raid warden's office. You will surely be struck by the claustrophobic atmosphere and get a good idea of what life must have been like for people who lived in these underground shelters for weeks at a time, during a period which lasted very nearly 3 years. And for a different take again, back in Valletta, the Lascaris war rooms. They too are underground, signposted from the entrance to the Upper Baraka Gardens, and when you get down there, I think you'll be surprised by the scale. It's a complete maze of corridors and fairly large rooms, built in a complex originally dug out by the Knights, but repurposed during World War II to be the headquarters for the British forces on Malta. And enough of what it was like at the time has been left for you to really get the idea and pick up the atmosphere. I would recommend actually that you go on one of the guided tours, because certainly the guide that I followed round was an absolute mine of information and really good at explaining it. So you will see, for example, the plotting room, where huge maps were spread out and radio operators were taking incoming information and plotters were using coloured counters to keep up with the constant stream of information about which planes were where, so that those in charge could make decisions about what to do next. There's lots of general information too about all sorts of things, reconnaissance missions, the convoys, the anti-aircraft artillery that was used, the air-sea rescue missions that had to be conducted, the types of aeroplane, yes, the Gloucester Gladiator again, and others with daring-do names like Hawker Hurricane and Supermarine Spitfire. There are diagrams of the various flying formations they used for different sorts of attack or defence. An absolute haven, I should imagine, for all those interested in military history. But even if that's not particularly your thing, I think the impression you'll pick up of the serious work that was done down there by so many people, many of them only in their 20s, will fire your imagination. Again, the Ladies of Lascaris book is very good on this, describing the work of Christina Ratcliffe, who was recruited to work as an aircraft plotter in the top-secret No. 8 Sector Operations Room. There are detailed descriptions of the plotting room and the maps and the drama of listening to how the pilots were faring, of following the exploits of some of the pilots, most of whom, of course, they knew personally, of hoping that they would make it back from their sorties, of knowing, of course, that sometimes they wouldn't. And he sums it up as follows. What took place there was one of the best-kept secrets of the Second World War in Malta. The secure but dark and sunless rooms became the nerve centre of Malta's defence, the whole complex ventilated with metal piping and ducting retrieved from ships that sunk in the Grand Harbour. Christina said, some people have likened the RAF's underground operational headquarters in Valletta to a maze of rabbit warrens. I think the name best suited is the one by which it was known to us all, the Hole. I thought then that I'd finish the episode with a mention of some of the memorials you can find near Valletta relating to this period. I mentioned them briefly in the episode on walks around Valletta, but this is an appropriate moment, I think, for a little bit more detail. So, the National War Memorial then, down near the Triton Fountain, actually built on a curious sort of roundabout affair in the middle of a busy road. I'm not quite sure why, but anyway, if you cross over to it, you will find a huge obelisk and an eternal flame and an inscription, actually not from World War II, from World War I, written by King George V on the 3rd of November 1918. Quote, "Let me assure you that I am fully conscious of the important and patriotic part that Malta has played during these years of warfare," a message he would surely have reiterated had he been alive at the end of World War II. But, as described earlier, at that point it fell to his son, King George VI, to honour Malta. Only 5 minutes or so walk from there is the Commonwealth Air Forces Memorial, a huge column with the golden eagle on top, alongside the RAF motto in Latin, per ardua ad astra, through hard work to the stars. A little plaque which says, this memorial was built and is maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and then the wording which explains what the memorial is doing here. Quote, "Over these and neighbouring lands and seas, the airmen whose names are recorded here fell in raid or sortie and have no known grave." And there are 2,300 names listed on that column, a separate section for each year, subdivided then by the countries from which they came, the UK, Canada, America, Australia, and a whole host of others, and every single one of them mentioned by name. This monument was unveiled in 1954 by Queen Elizabeth II, so the daughter of George VI, of George Cross fame, and the granddaughter of George V, whose citation from World War I just quoted. There are many connections actually between British royalty and Malta, not least the fact that Princess Elizabeth and her new husband, Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, were stationed on Malta for I think 2 years, not long after the Second World War, when he was serving in the Navy. I know they had very fond memories of it, and in fact, work is underfoot to convert the house in which they lived into a museum, which I think is due to open relatively soon, before 2030 certainly. So while I didn't get the chance to look round it, you may well do. And I think it'll have lots of stories to tell about yet another interesting facet of life on the island. Anyway, back to war memorials. Those are the main two, really, but I did want to mention the ruins of the Royal Opera House, which you'll see in Republic Street. It was more or less completely destroyed by a German bomb in 1942, and for decades after that the ruins just sat there, a reminder of the destruction which had been wrought on Valletta and on Malta during the war. It is still there, so still serves as a memory of all of those things, but it's been adapted by the architect Lorenzo Piano into an outdoor concert venue, so leaving the ruins but adding staging and seating. A very clever mix of a memorial and a useful venue. And I can well imagine that the dwindling number of people who still have a memory of World War II will think of it, albeit briefly, every time they pass by this city centre venue. As we lose the last veterans and the people who were children in the wartime, it's going to be harder to remember all those things. But surely, we really ought to try. That more or less wraps up this episode then, but just before going, I thought I might mention that if World War II is an interest of yours, there are several of our other City Break series which do have episodes on it. 2 German ones, Munich, where episodes 7, 8 and 9 tell the story of how Hitler first rose to power while living in the city there, of what happened in Munich during World War II, and a very moving episode, episode 9, about some of the incredibly brave resistance groups who tried to stand up to Hitler. In the Berlin series, there are 4 episodes dealing with the war and the various museums and memorials which help us remember it. There's an episode on the Holocaust, there's another one on the Berlin Wall, and one too on East Germany, and how you can still find many traces of the German Democratic Republic in the reunited Berlin of today. There are episodes too scattered over our various French series. In the Paris series, there's one on occupied Paris. There's a World War II episode also in the Bordeaux series. Think German submarine bases and all the subterfuge and factions of a city where there were not only German troops occupying the city but also resistance groups and no small number of spies, all trying to find out what each other was doing. And in the Toulouse series, episode 4 I think it is on the resistance in Toulouse. The blog post is entitled How Toulouse Fought Back in World War II, and there are lots of stories of very brave people who had to use all their ingenuity to try and fight back against the German occupation and send British and American pilots who'd crashed safely back home so they could return to their duties. I managed to dig out quite a lot of interesting stories, so if that's your thing, do have a look at any of those episodes. There's a podcast for each of them if you've got the time to listen to it, perhaps on a commute or a dog walk. And if you just want a quick look at all the main details, there is of course a blog post to go with each of the episodes. Having dealt then in this episode and the last with Malta's 2 big wartime moments, I'm moving on to something completely different next time, in an episode which I think is going to be called Art, Architecture and Archaeology. So grouping together bits and pieces about all those things, mainly from Valletta itself, but with little references to the rest of the island too. Again, it'll be a mix of info and references to places you can visit to find out more. So I hope very much that you'll be along for the ride on that one too, and for the moment, let me dust off my way to say goodbye in Maltese, and then sign out with the end music. So here goes then. Thank you and goodbye, with thanks yet again to Google Translate. Grazie hufna. Sahar.